Beyond the courts and castles of the lords, kings and emperors, life in the medieval period for most was tough and gruelling. Keeping the higher classes rich and the bigger cities fed, the peasants toiled from sunrise to sunset, often little more than slaves. With long days of backbreaking work, oppressive masters, barely enough food to survive, terrible living conditions, and waves of disease, the peasant's life was a simple, miserable, and thankless one that remained virtually unchanged for centuries. From the time the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, Europe slowly began to take shape into something more recognizably modern. The medieval period, or Middle Ages, running from around 500 to 1500 AD, saw the mass migration of people across the continent as new lords and kings filled the gaps left behind by the Romans. From the 7th century, the Islamic dynasties formed in Arabia began pushing into Europe from the south, and the Crusades followed shortly after. As the surviving Roman Empire in the East adapted and evolved, so did Christianity, and the Great Schism of 1054 changed the religious landscape forever. Viking raids and pillages became a constant nuisance from the 9th century, and the outbreak of plague in the 14th century killed tens of millions of people. But while the medieval period was the slow evolution from the old world into the new, as empires rose and fell and epic warfare was waged, for those at the bottom rung of society's ladder, centuries passed by with little change. To the peasant, rather than paying tax to a Roman provincial governor for living on and working their land, they paid it to a local noble instead. Across the continent, feudal systems were propped up by a population of filthy, miserable slaves, and their lives didn't get any easier. Across medieval Europe, the life of a peasant would begin in the same way. The church bell would ring at dawnbreak, and villagers would rise to attend the morning service and prayers. Europe was strictly Catholic, and religion played a big role in the lives of the poor. The village priest was a peasant himself, albeit one of higher standing with more power. Through him, the illiterate peasantry had a direct route to God. He reminded the villagers of the importance of obedience to the nobles, honest living, and hard work which would be rewarded in the afterlife. The morning service over, the villagers would head outside, where they'd spend most of their day working. These villages often lay in the shadows of their noble's castle, and peasants' entire lives passed by inside them. Making up around 90% of the rural population in Europe, the majority of peasants worked the land, toiling from dawn to dusk, producing grain and other crops for their lords. Other peasants fulfilled simple but essential roles that kept the village running. As well as the priest giving the people their access to God, peasant blacksmiths kept the farmers' tools in working order, millers and bakers kept them all fed, and brewers gave them something to drink. Some peasants were hunters, heading to the nearby woods in search of game, but most of what they caught went to the castle. The ruling nobles had little contact with their people, leaving higher-ranking peasants in charge. The farmers were supervised by bailiffs, still of the peasant class, but with some extra power and privilege, while a steward was the highest ranking of all peasants, running the day-to-day of village life. The remainder worked the land, held to it in bondage via serfdom, a type of slavery prevalent throughout Europe. The serfs lived on land owned by nobles, where they were assigned strips of land to work, typically sowing corn, rye, oats, and barley, harvesting the crop once matured with scythes and sickles. The bulk of their harvest went to their noble in rent and tax, with only a small portion being kept to feed themselves for another year. The days on the field were long and hard, broken up by a quick meal of bread and pottage, a type of stew made mostly of grain with vegetables, and another service at the local church, summoned by the bell ringing once again. Animals played a big part in village life. Cows and chickens were on hand to keep manure, milk, cheese, butter, and eggs flowing, but meat was a rare treat on the dinner plate outside of times of hardship or a religious festival. When the sun began to set, the church bell would signal the day was over, and the exhausted peasantry would return to their homes to rest. Village houses were usually made out of a combination of twigs, straw, dung, soil, and clay. They were dark, damp, small, and usually only one room with no windows. A family's livestock would be brought inside with them at night to keep them safe, and a hearth in the center would keep them warm and cook their meals, making the room smoky and hot. One luxury the peasants could enjoy in abundance was ale. Untaxed by the nobles, ale was part of the payment made to peasants for working the land, meaning everyone had access to it as long as the local brewers' supplies held out. At drinking houses, they could relax and have fun. Many would play games of cards, dice, and bowling, with violence regularly erupting. For the most part, the peasant community was entirely self-sufficient and basically self-governing. They fed themselves from their harvests and animals, kept themselves clothed with leather and wool from their livestock, and even settled their own disputes and punished their own criminals. Everyone was responsible for the welfare of the village population. Another big factor of a peasant's life was death. Half of newborn babies died before they were 1. The peasants had no real understanding of hygiene, and villages and towns were filthy, with no sewage systems, meaning waste was either tossed in the streets or the river where others collected drinking water. With no understanding of basic hygiene, bathing was said to occur just twice in a peasant's life, once when they were born, and again when they died. As a result, their villages became a perfect breeding ground for disease. After living the same way for hundreds of years, things slowly began to change for the peasantry around the 10th century. Towns that had been few and far between become more common, giving the peasants access to more amenities and sometimes other roles. But as populations boomed and people began living closer together in larger numbers, disease became a bigger problem. The arrival of the Black Death around 1346 killed tens of millions of people from every class. It was the most devastating outbreak of any disease in human history, wiping out 1/3 of the European population. Amidst the death and suffering, the scale of production on farms dropped. With fewer people left to work the fields and fewer people needing to be fed, grain prices dropped and many farmlands were abandoned. Those still alive began to challenge their nobles over their high taxes and poor living conditions. Recognizing how valuable they had become, many revolted and rose up against their lords. The foundations of the old world had been rattled, and gradually the nobles relented. Better wages and more freedoms allowed for education and more opportunity. Slowly, peasants began appearing in higher places in society. Although it would take hundreds of years after their first revolts for serfdom to be abolished, the life of the peasant was finally starting to change for the better. Around the 16th century, as the continent recovered, a gradually modernizing world began to emerge, and the medieval period came to an end. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more. Like a medieval lord sitting comfortably as taxes roll in, turn on notifications and have all of our latest videos delivered directly to you.